From Southern Oregon Public Television in Medford, Oregon, this is Democracy Now!
This is a serious and big storm. And my first message is to all the people across the eastern seaboard, mid-Atlantic, going north, that you need to take this very seriously. The superstorm arrives. Tens of millions from the Carolinas to Boston brace for Hurricane Sandy, possibly the largest storm ever to hit the U.S. mainland. We'll speak with climate scientist Greg Jones here in Oregon, meteorologist Jeff Masters, and writer and activist Bill McKibben on the connection between global warming and hurricanes.
The basic physical property here is that warm air holds more water vapor than cold. You can get stronger storms. The atmosphere is about 4% wetter than it was 40 years ago. That's an enormous change in a basic physical parameter. It loads the dice for both drought, as you're getting increased evaporation, and deluge and downpour and flood, and that's what we're seeing all over the planet.
We will also go to Haiti, where Hurricane Sandy killed at least 50 people, devastating parts of the country still recovering from the 2010 earthquake. And we'll look at the storm's impact on the nuclear industry. At least 16 nuclear plants are in the path of this unprecedented storm. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. We're broadcasting from Medford, Oregon. Much of the East Coast is shut down today as residents brace for Hurricane Sandy, a massive storm that could be the most powerful to hit the United States in decades. Hundreds of thousands of people have already been evacuated. Millions could lose power over the next day. Meteorologists say Hurricane Sandy is a rare hybrid superstorm created by an Arctic jet stream wrapping itself around a tropical storm, creating what could be the largest hurricane ever to hit the U.S. mainland. On Sunday, President Obama urged East Coast residents to take the storm very seriously.
This is a serious and big storm. And my first message is to all the people across the eastern seaboard, mid-Atlantic, going north, that you need to take this very seriously and follow the instructions of your state and local officials, because they are going to be providing you with the best advice in terms of how to deal with this storm over the coming days.
The storm has already killed 66 people in the Caribbean, where it battered Haiti and Cuba. In Haiti, a top UN relief official warned of a heightened risk of a new outbreak of waterborne disease.
So the entire southern peninsula, including the province, the county where Port-au-Prince is, has been very heavily affected with flooding. Rivers have burst out of their banks. The canals running through Port-au-Prince, because Port-au-Prince lies in a valley surrounded by hills. What we fear most is that there might be spikes in waterborne diseases, especially cholera, which we always see after flooding or rains in Haiti.
New York is among a number of U.S. cities to close schools and transit systems in preparation for the storm. The entire New York subway system is being shut down for the second time in 14 months after no previous instances. The New York Stock Exchange is also closed in its first unscheduled shutdown since 2001. On Sunday, New York City Mayor Michael Bloomberg ordered the evacuation of tens of thousands in low-lying areas.
In light of these conditions, I'm going to sign an executive order mandating evacuation of Zone A areas. I'm also ordering that all of the city's public schools be closed on Monday. Now, first, as to the evacuation zone, let me stress that we are ordering this evacuation for the safety of the approximately 375,000 people who live in these areas. If you live in these areas, you should leave them this afternoon.
With just over a week before the election, both President Obama and Republican challenger Mitt Romney have scaled back campaigning as Hurricane Sandy approaches. The two campaigns have canceled a combined 17 events and suspended fundraising emails in states that lie in the storm's path. On Saturday, President Obama rallied supporters in New Hampshire, where he criticized Romney's record as governor of neighboring Massachusetts.
During Governor Romney's campaign for governor down there, he promised the same thing he's promising now. Said he'd fight for jobs and middle-class families. But once he took office, he pushed through a tax cut that overwhelmingly benefited 278 of the wealthiest families in the state. And then he raised taxes and fees on middle-class families to the tune of $750 million. Does that sound familiar to you?
Appearing, meanwhile, in Ohio, Romney rallied supporters by invoking the mantra of a fictional football team depicted in the television drama Friday Night Lights.
There's a fictional football team that used to be on TV. And as the team would go out of their locker room, often facing daunting odds, they'd touch a sign that said, clear eyes, full hearts, can't lose. You've seen it. And that's how I feel about Ohio. You guys, you got clear eyes and full hearts, and on November 6th, we can't lose with your help. We're taking back America.
At least 4 people were killed Sunday when U.S. drones struck northern Yemen. The victims were alleged militants in Sada province, though U.S. policy is to deem any adult-age male targeted by drones as a militant unless proven otherwise after they're killed. It was the 4th known U.S. drone strike inside Yemen this month. Violence is continuing unabated in Syria, despite an international ceasefire brokered late last week. On Sunday, Syrian activists said at least 16 people, including 7 children, were killed when government warplanes bombed residential areas in the province of Idlib. Aerial attacks were also reportedly launched on eastern suburbs of the capital of Damascus. The top United Nations investigator on Palestinian human rights is calling for a boycott of all companies linked to settlements in the occupied West Bank. Richard Falk, the special rapporteur on human rights in the Palestinian territories, said firms including Hewlett-Packard, Motorola, Volvo, and Caterpillar are complicit in the Israeli occupation.
This is an attempt to reach out beyond the intergovernmental and international institutional system. And one of the things that our report recommends is encouragement of the boycott of these named corporations and encouragement of civil society actors to join in that boycott.
The Obama administration has rejected Falk's proposal, calling it, quote, irresponsible and unacceptable. Planned Parenthood has filed a new lawsuit challenging a funding ban in Texas that seeks to exclude from a program for low-income women. The Texas program offers cancer and health screenings as well as birth control services to some 130,000 women, about 40% of whom are served through Planned Parenthood. But Texas Governor Rick Perry has sought to bar Planned Parenthood's involvement because the group also provides abortions. An appeals court upheld the ban last week, but on Friday, a Texas judge issued a temporary restraining order pending arguments in a new challenge from Planned Parenthood. Attorneys for Planned Parenthood say the ban is illegal because it would force Texas to lose 90% of the program's funding from the federal government. A coalition of environmental groups has asked the Environmental Protection Agency to subject oil and gas extracting companies to the same emissions oversight as other energy industry sectors. The Environmental Integrity Project, the lead organization behind the request, says companies, especially those that conduct fracking, should have to report their emissions to the Toxic Release Inventory, or TRI. In a statement, the group said, quote, despite the many indications of the toxicity of the chemicals used in shale oil and gas removal, the extraction industry is one of the few within the energy sector that does not report to the TRI. The request comes on the heels of recent studies alleging increased health risks in communities exposed to fracking. A survey by Earthworks of residents in 14 Pennsylvania counties found fracking has led to an 80% increase in sinus problems and 70% increase in throat irritation. A recent U.S. Geological Survey study in Wyoming found fracking chemicals have again been found in the groundwater of the town of Pavilion, affirming the conclusion of an EPA study last year. And a leading Pakistani politician and campaigner against U.S. drone attacks was detained and questioned over his political views on Friday while trying to enter the United States. Imran Khan says he was taken off a flight from Toronto to New York and interrogated by U.S. agents about his public opposition to drones. Announcing the incident after his questioning, Khan tweeted, quote, "My stance is known. Drone attacks must stop." Earliest month, Imran Khan led a march of thousands of people in Pakistan to rally against the drones. Imran Khan was a well-known cricketer who's running for president in Pakistan. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. We're on the road in Medford, Oregon, broadcasting from Southern Oregon Public Television. Much of the East Coast is shut down today as residents prepare for Hurricane Sandy, a massive storm that could impact up to 50 million people from the Carolinas to Boston. New York and other cities have shut down schools and transit systems. Hundreds of thousands of people have already been evacuated. Millions could lose power over the next day. The storm has already killed 66 people in the Caribbean, where it battered Haiti and Cuba. Meteorologists say Sandy could be the largest ever to hit the U.S. mainland. While not as powerful as Hurricane Katrina, the storm stretches a record 520 miles from its eye. Earlier this morning, the National Hurricane Center said the hurricane's wind speed increased to 85 miles per hour, with additional strengthening possible, describing it as a rare hybrid superstorm. Forecasters say Sandy was created by an Arctic jet stream wrapping itself around a tropical storm. The storm could cause up to 12 inches of rain in some areas, as well as up to 3 feet of snowfall in the Appalachian Mountains. Flooding is also expected to be a major problem. The National Weather Service has warned of record-level flooding and life-threatening storm surges in coastal areas. The Nuclear Regulatory Commission has announced it's taking special precautions for the storm. There are at least 16 nuclear reactors located within the path of the storm. 6 oil refineries are also in the storm's path. While the news media have been covering Hurricane Sandy around the clock, little attention has been paid to the possible connection between the storm and climate change. Scientists have long warned how global warming would make North Atlantic hurricanes more powerful. Just 2 weeks ago, the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences published a major study on the connection between warmer sea surface temperatures and increase in stronger Atlantic hurricanes. The report said, quote, "In particular, we estimate that Katrina magnitude events have been twice as frequent in warm years compared with cold years." We begin today's show with 2 guests. With me here in Oregon, we're joined by Greg Jones, climate scientist and professor of environmental studies at Southern Oregon University in Ashland. And joining us by Democracy Now! Video stream is Bill McKibben, co-founder and director of 350.org. He's author of numerous books, including Earth, Making a Life on a Tough New Planet. On November 7th, 350.org is launching a 20-city nationwide tour called Do the Math, to connect the dots between extreme weather, climate change, and the fossil fuel industry. We welcome you both to Democracy Now! Let's start with Bill McKibben. Bill, you've just made it back to Vermont, to your home. Can you talk about the significance of what the East Coast is facing right now?
Well, I think, Amy, that the first thing is this is a storm of really historic proportion. It's really like something we haven't seen before. It's huge. It's half again the size of Texas. It's coming across water that's near record warmth as it makes its way up the East Coast. Apparently, we're seeing lower pressures north of Cape Hatteras than have been ever recorded before. The storm surge, which is going to be the very worst part of this storm, is being driven by that huge size and expanse of the storm. But of course, it comes in on water that's already somewhat higher than it would have been in the past because of sea level rise. It's a monster. It's Frankenstorm, frankly, is not only a catchy name, in many ways, it's the right name for it. This thing is stitched together from elements natural and unnatural, and it seems poised to cause real havoc. The governor of Connecticut said yesterday, the last time we saw anything like this was never. And I think that's about right.
There certainly was a lack of discussion, to put it mildly, in the presidential debates around the issue of climate change.
Yeah.
I don't think it was raised at all in the
Romney's feeling this morning for having the one mention he's made the whole time, his big laugh line at the Republican convention was how silly it was for Obama to be talking about slowing the rise of the oceans. I'd say that's wins pretty much every prize for ironic right now. There has been a pervading climate silence. We're doing our best to break that. Yesterday afternoon, there was a demonstration in Times Square, a sort of giant dot to connect the dots with all the other climate trouble around the world. Overnight, continuing in Boston, there's a week-long vigil outside Government Center to try and get the Senate candidates there to address the issue of climate change. It's incredibly important that we not only, first priority is obviously people's safety and assisting relief efforts in every possible way. But it's also really important that everybody, even those who aren't in the kind of path of this storm, reflect about what it means that in the warmest year in U.S. history, when we've seen the warmest month, July, of any month, any year in U.S. history, in a year when we saw essentially summer sea ice in the Arctic just vanish before our eyes, what it means that we're now seeing storms of this unprecedented magnitude. If there was ever a wake-up call, this is it.
Let me play the clip you're referring to of Mitt Romney at the Republican convention in Tampa.
President Obama promised to begin to slow the rise of the oceans. And to heal the planet. My promise is to help you and your family.
That was Mitt Romney at the conventions, but at the Republican convention. But again, when it came to the presidential debate, neither President Obama nor Mitt Romney raised the issue of climate change. I wanted to bring Greg Jones, climate scientist and professor of environmental studies here at Southern Oregon University in Ashland, into the conversation. The connection between the superstorm we're seeing and climate change.
Well, this is clearly a very unique event, and I as a climate scientist, to some degree, I kind of worry that these type of unique events are clearly more frequent in the future. We have the conditions that have produced something that could be very damaging for the East Coast of the United States, and I often wonder why we don't see more of them. But you know, the question is today is that where we are in terms of our climate science understanding of these things. The rarity of this event is what makes it very unique, and I think all of the conditions came together to produce a superstorm. And we've had a few that have been close to this, but given the number of people involved and the location where it's coming on shore, it's a very problematic event.
Mm-hmm. Bill McKibben, what do you think has to happen now? You have been traveling the world warning people, working with organizations around the issue of climate change. Do you feel like the kind of organizing you're doing has an effect? I mean, you see these 3 presidential debates, tens of millions of people watch them. They sort of define the discourse in this country, and yet not raised in any, it's not only the candidates don't raise them, the reporters who are the moderators of these debates don't raise the issue.
Look, we're up against the most powerful and richest industry on earth, and the status quo is their friend. They want nothing to change, and until we're able to force them to the table, as it were, very little will happen in Washington or elsewhere. That's why we launched this huge tour beginning the night after the election, not coincidentally, in Seattle and continuing around the country. You can find out about it at math.350.org. But the point is that we really finally need to have this reckoning. Either the fossil fuel industry keeps pouring carbon into the atmosphere and we keep seeing this kind of event, or we take some action. Here's the thing always to remember: the crazy changes that we're seeing now, the fact that we broke the Arctic this summer, the fact that the oceans are 30% more acid, that's all happened when you raised the temperature of the Earth 1 degree. The same scientists who told us that was going to happen are confident that the temperature will go up 4 degrees, maybe 5, unless we get off coal and gas and oil very quickly. And to do that, it's nice to talk to Washington, but in certain ways, Washington's turned into customer service for the fossil fuel industry. It's time to take on that industry directly. Not time today. Time today is to take care of people all up and down the East Coast, to work in the relief efforts, to get the message out as this storm heads north. We in Vermont, knowing from last year's superstorm Irene, have a pretty good idea of just how traumatic this is going to be. So the short-term effort's all about people. But the slightly longer-term effort is to make sure that we're not creating a world where this kind of thing happens over and over and over again.
Bill, you mentioned that the storm is made up of elements both natural and unnatural. What do you mean by that?
Well, look, I mean, global warming doesn't cause hurricanes. We've always had hurricanes. Hurricanes cause when a tropical wave comes off the coast of Africa and moves onto warm water, and the wind shear is low enough to let it form a circulation and so on and so forth. But we're producing conditions like record warm temperatures in seawater that make it easier for this sort of thing to get, in this case, up the Atlantic with a head of steam. We're raising the sea levels, and when that happens, it means that whatever storm surge comes in from a higher level than it would have before. We're seeing. And there are meteorologists, although I don't think this is well studied enough yet to really say it conclusively. There are people saying that things like the huge amount of open water in the Arctic have been changing patterns of big wind current patterns across the continent that may be contributing to these blocking pressure areas and things that we're seeing. But to me, that at this point is still mostly speculation. What really is different is that there is more moisture and more energy in this narrow envelope of atmosphere, and that energy expresses itself in all kinds of ways. That's why we get these record rainfalls now, time after time. I mean, last year it was Irene and then Lee directly after that. This year, this storm, they're saying, could be a 1,000-year rainfall event across the mid-Atlantic. I think that means more rain than you'd expect to see in 1,000 years, but I can pretty much, I'd be willing to bet that it won't be long before we see another one of them, because we're changing the odds. By changing the Earth, we change the odds. And one thing for all of us to remember today, even as we deal with the horror on the East Coast, is that this is exactly the kind of horror people have been dealing with all over the world. 20 million people were dislocated by flood in Pakistan 2 years ago. There are people with kind of existential fears about whether their nations will survive the rise of sea level. We're seeing horrific drought, not just in the Midwest, but in much of the rest of the world. This is the biggest thing that's ever happened on Earth, climate change. And our response has to be the same kind of magnitude.
Bill McKibben, why are you waiting till after the presidential election to have your 20-city tour raising the issue, calling it Do the Math?
Well, I mean, we've been involved as we can be in the in the political fight, but we don't want this issue to go away when elections are over. Even if Barack Obama wins, we do not want everybody to just, oh, well, he'll take care of it. That's what happened 4 years ago. What we want is for no matter who wins, and no matter who wins in the Senate and the House, we want to put the fossil fuel industry front and center and put real pressure on them. We're going to try and launch a divestment movement that looks like the one around South Africa a quarter century ago. We're going to be bringing home the math that I described in a piece in Rolling Stone this summer that went kind of viral, explaining that the fossil fuel industry already has 5 times more carbon in its inventory than even the most conservative government thinks would be safe to burn. And every day they go out looking for more. This is a rogue industry now. I mean, if Sandy is a rogue storm, then say Exxon is a rogue industry. They, in their inventory alone, have more than 7% of the carbon necessary to take us past 2 degrees. They're outlaws not against the laws of the state, but against the laws of physics. And you begin to see the results of that when you look around events like today's.
Bill McKibben, I want to thank you for being with us. And very quickly, how are people in Vermont preparing? I mean, when Hurricane Irene hit, it ended up not being a very big deal in New York, but it ended up being a massive catastrophe for your state, for Vermont.
And in Vermont, in a very long time, we're expecting to lose power and have very strong winds. I think selfishly, those of us in Vermont are just almost psychologically, we really, a year later, don't need to be the center of this storm. We don't wish it on anybody else. But physically and psychologically, Vermont's barely recovered from Irene. And we have some incredible sense of sympathy for the people who are getting hammered hardest by Sandy this time around.
Well, I want to thank you, Bill McKibben, for being with us, founder of 350.org, speaking to us from his home in Vermont. When we come back, we'll stay with Greg Jones, climate scientist, professor of environmental studies here at Southern Oregon University in Ashland. And we'll be joined by meteorologist Jeff Masters. Stay with us.
Oh, where have you been, my blue-eyed son? And where have you been, my darling young one? I stumbled along the sides of 12 misty mountains. I'm walking and crawling 6 crooked highways. I've stepped in the middle of 7 sad forests. I've been out in front of a dozen dead oceans. I've been 10,000 miles in the mouth of a graveyard. And it's hard, and it's hard, and it's hard, and it's hard, and it's a hard rains are gonna fall. Oh, what did you see, my blue-eyed son? And what did you see, my darling young one? I saw a newborn baby with wild wolves all around it. I saw a highway of diamonds with nobody on it. I saw a black branch with blood that kept dripping. I saw a room full of men with their hammers a-bleeding. I saw 10,000 talkers whose tongues were all broken. I saw guns and sharp swords.
DemocracyNow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. We're on the road in Medford, Oregon, at Southern Oregon Public Television. But the story today is on the East Coast as we continue our coverage of Hurricane Sandy, a massive storm that could impact up to 50 million people. From the Carolinas to Boston, New York, and other cities have shut down schools and transit systems. Hundreds of thousands of people have already been evacuated. Millions could lose power over the next day. We are continuing here in Ashland, Oregon with Greg Jones, climate scientist, professor of environmental studies at Southern Oregon University in Ashland. And joining us by Democracy Now! Video stream is Jeff Masters, director of meteorology at the Weather Underground, which was just bought by Weather Channel. Jeff Masters, welcome to Democracy Now! Can you explain what is happening right now on the East Coast?
We've got a Caribbean hurricane that formed last week, moved northwards through the Bahamas, is now offshore the coast of Virginia. It's maintained its hurricane strength. It's got 85-mile-per-hour winds, and it's starting to accelerate towards the coast now as a wintertime low-pressure system starts to suck it in. The scale of this storm is just remarkable. The U.S. has never seen this sort of a large storm where you've got winds that are tropical storm force, about 900 miles in diameter, and the radius of 12-foot seas surrounding this storm is more than 500 miles. So over 1,100-mile diameter area of 12-foot high waves. Just a massive storm. It really deserves the label superstorm.
What is the death toll so far?
Last I saw was about 65. 11 of those were in Cuba, which is very good about their disaster preparedness. That's an unusually high death toll for them. And then the majority of the deaths were in Haiti, where they don't have as good a public sort of response system because of all the deforestation that's gone on there and the poverty and, of course, the earthquake of 2 years ago.
And what do you think of the preparations for this storm?
In the U.S., I think people are getting the message. Whether they act on it or not, I don't know. This part of the world where it's getting hit doesn't have a lot of storm experience. We did have Hurricane Irene last year, but that fizzled out a little bit right before landfall, and we didn't get as high a storm surge as we were expecting. Storm surge is the most dangerous part of a hurricane typically, and it's going ashore in an area that doesn't have much experience with this sort of event. And this will be a 1 in 200 or 1 in 100 year sort of event for them. There's already record storm surge flooding occurring along the shore of New Jersey. It's going to get much worse tonight when the high tide comes in.
Can you compare this hurricane to Sandy to Irene?
Sure. Hurricane Irene brought about a 9.5-foot storm tide to New York City. Sandy is expected to bring a foot or two higher than that, which potentially will flood the subway system in New York City. So a higher storm surge. As far as the rains go, Irene had higher rains. This storm's going to have about 30% less rainfall, and you're not going to see the kind of catastrophic rainfall flooding damage that we saw with Irene, which amounted to something like $16 billion. And in part, that's because the soils are drier and the rivers are lower right now. We've been in a little bit of a drought condition in the Northeast. So the rains aren't going to be that big of an issue. The winds, however, are going to be a huge issue because they're going to affect a massive amount of coastline. Again, over 500-mile stretch of coast is going to see winds in excess of probably 50 miles per hour. With the trees still with their leaves on them, you're going to see a lot of tree damage, a lot of power failures. I expect over 10 million people will suffer power failures during this storm.
Can you talk about climate change and whether it makes this storm more destructive?
Whenever you add more heat to the oceans, you've got more energy for destruction. And hurricanes are heat engines. They pull heat out of the ocean, convert it to the kinetic energy of their winds. So the approximately 1 degree Fahrenheit warming of the oceans we've experienced over the past century does directly increase the winds of hurricanes. And that's of concern because just if you've got a 5% increase in hurricane winds, that doesn't translate to a 5% increase in damage. The damage of the wind goes by some power, like the second or third power. So a 5% increase in the winds causes a much higher degree of wind damage. So that's the main thing as far as heat in the oceans goes about the effect on hurricanes. The other thing to think about is when you do heat the oceans up more, you extend the length of hurricane season. And there's been ample evidence over the last decade or so that hurricane season's getting longer. Starts earlier, ends later. You're more likely to get these sort of late October storms now. And you're more likely to have this sort of situation where a late October storm meets up with a regular winter low pressure system and gives us this ridiculous combination of a nor'easter and a hurricane that comes ashore, bringing all kinds of destructive effects.
Were you disappointed, Jeff Masters, that in the 3 presidential debates that tens of millions of people were watching, the issue of climate change did not arise?
Yeah, absolutely. Climate change has become the new Voldemort of our times, that which cannot be named. And it's ridiculous that we can't talk about a subject that's directly influencing our lives now and will continue to do so even more strongly in the future. I see Superstorm Sandy here as kind of a wake-up call coming the week before the election. Hey, America, hey, politicians, pay attention to this. We're experiencing an unusual number of very rare meteorological events, and they're probably not all due to just random variations in the weather. We do expect extreme events of this nature to increase in the future, and we should be paying attention to the fact that we've had a very large number of these billion-dollar sorts of disasters in recent years.
I'm wondering, Greg Jones, as a climate scientist here at the Southern Oregon University in Ashland, if you find the same kind of silence around the issue of climate change.
Sure. You know, right now it's really sad to see all of our political entities not approaching this in some way, shape, or form. It's not an electable issue. Not until the public sees it to be important enough to demand something more from both parties. It's really unfortunate, and I see it in my students as well. There's some apathy relative to both the weather and climate until the types of damage that a hurricane like this system can bring. You know, I don't think that people wake up enough and see those kind of issues as being directly tied to what we do in the fossil fuel industry and in terms of changing the climate, changing the surface of the earth and the oceans. Those are all very problematic issues, and the parties just aren't there with it.
You look at the effects of climate change on wineries here on the West Coast?
Well, I've been studying climate and how it affects agricultural crops for years. My main area of study is looking at how climate influences growing grapes and making wine. Now, it's a very important issue, but it's very frivolous compared to the hurricane that's bearing down on the East Coast right now. But the issue is that all crops have very fine climate niches relative to their surroundings, and small changes in climate can completely change coffee, pineapples, chocolate, wine, any of these types of very specialized crops that we grow. Plus, it also has an issue for broad-based crops. Whether or not those broad-based crops like corn and soybeans and wheat can produce consistently in a changing climate is a big question for the future.
I mean, it's a very serious issue when you're talking about a term that a lot of people don't hear about in the United States, climate refugees, sure. When food becomes scarce because of climate change.
Sure. We have some serious issues with dealing with this. I mean, many of our crops, you take rice grown in Southeast Asia as being feeding the largest population on Earth. Small changes in monsoon rainfalls can bring about, disaster. And so just small changes, I think, is really very important as we look at these crop systems. Humans in general, as we talk about what we do daily and weekly and seasonally, small changes in climate don't mean very much to us. But when they impact our food systems and how they're produced, that's where we have real problems.
I wanted to ask you, Jeff Masters, about geoengineering, also as well, Greg Jones. Naomi Klein had a fascinating piece in the New York Times yesterday called Geoengineering Testing the Waters, where she talked about being on British Columbia's shoreline, the Sunshine Coast, and seeing orcas in the water, killer whales, and being shocked by this extremely rare visit. And she said, the possibility the sighting may have resulted from something less serendipitous did not occur to me until 2 weeks ago when I read reports of a bizarre ocean experiment off the islands of Haida Gwaii, several hundred miles from where we spotted the orcas swimming. There, an American entrepreneur named Russ George dumped 120 tons of iron dust off the hull of a rented fishing boat. The plan to create an algae bloom that would sequester carbon and thereby combat climate change. And she goes on to say, Mr. George is one of a growing number of would-be geoengineers who advocate high-risk, large-scale technical interventions that would fundamentally change the oceans and skies in order to reduce the effects of global warming. In addition to Mr. George's scheme to fertilize the ocean with iron, other geoengineering strategies under consideration include pumping sulfate aerosols into the upper atmosphere to imitate the cooling effects of a major volcanic eruption and brightening clouds so they reflect more of the sun's rays back to space. And she goes on to say that the risks are huge. Ocean fertilization could trigger dead zones and toxic tides. Multiple simulations have predicted that mimicking the effects of a volcano would interfere with monsoons in Asia and Africa, potentially threatening water and food security for billions of people. Jeff Masters, your response, and then Greg Jones.
It's a high-risk sort of thing, and it's quite controversial. We don't know how we're affecting the climate now, so you add another element of risk by deliberately modifying it. And we should definitely do a lot more study before we do any sort of real implementation of a geoengineering scheme. I do think we should study it, and we may get desperate enough that we'll have to do it. I call geoengineering a bad idea whose time may come. When you're down 2 touchdowns late in the 4th quarter, sometimes you got to throw deep. I mean, it's a terrible gamble, and it will cause unexpected effects, including a drought, shift of rainfall patterns. But if civilization itself is potentially going to collapse because of what we're doing to the climate, maybe we need to consider these sorts of things. Not in the near future, but down the road a few decades.
Naomi Klein asks, what are the real solutions to climate change? She says, wouldn't it be better to change our behavior to reduce our use of fossil fuels before we begin fiddling with the planet's basic life support systems? Craig Jones.
Well, I mean, Jeff is correct here. I think these are measures that we're looking at because we haven't approached it maybe in the best possible way of just dealing with our usage of fuels. But geoengineering, there is a tremendous number of different potentials there. The problem typically is scaling it up to something that is going to be effective at the global scale. That doesn't cause any other ramifications into whatever system it is, whether it's the oceans or the atmosphere or the surface of the earth. We need to do the studies, I think, to find out what is going to be the most effective strategies in geoengineering. But it's a real challenge to these types of research projects when we know that the outcomes probably aren't scalable to the global scale.
We're going to break, and when we come back, we're going to go to Haiti. I want to thank you, Greg Jones, for being with us, climate scientist at Southern Oregon University. Also, I want to thank Jeff Masters for being with us from Michigan, from Ann Arbor. Jeff Masters runs Weather Underground, which was just bought by Weather Channel. We'll continue to follow what is taking place on the East Coast and deal with the issue of climate change. This is Democracy Now! We'll be back in a minute.
Tu voudrais que je chante encore le doux chant des petits oiseaux pour te plaire. Même quand j'entends des cris de mort qui sortent de nos cachots putrides, que je chante l'eau claire des ruisseaux, des rivières, devant l'Artibonite, rouge du sang de nos frères. Tu te dis pacifique, tu te dis apolitique, mon frère. T'aimes bien les chanteurs de charme, ça plaît bien aux belles dames. Quand elle tombe dans les pommes, ça ne fait de mal à personne. Quand le chanteur se trémousse devant l'Amérique qui glousse, les idoles ça donne des thrills, ça fait oublier les missiles. Salvador et Haïti, la Grenade et compagnie, mon frère. Quand le show business fait des sous, on n'est plus raciste du tout, mon frère. On aime le rock, on aime le blues. On disco.
Charlemagne singing My Brother, Mon Frère. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman as we continue our coverage of Hurricane Sandy. The Nuclear Regulatory Commission has acknowledged the massive storm could impact coastal and inland nuclear plants. At least 16 plants are in the storm's projected path, including North Anna and Surrey in Virginia, Calvert Cliffs in Maryland, Hope Creek and Salem in New Jersey, Indian Point in New York, Millstone in Connecticut. So far, there have been no reports of reactors shutting down, despite operating under licenses that require them to do so if weather conditions are too severe. The Nuclear Regulatory Commission met on Sunday to discuss the precautions needed to secure vulnerable plants during the storm. Spokeswoman Diane Skranke said, quote, "They're all designed to withstand the natural phenomena, including hurricanes and what comes with hurricanes, high winds, high water, that kind of thing." Well, for more, we go now to Burlington, Vermont, to speak with Arnie Gunderson, former nuclear industry senior vice president, who's coordinated projects at 70 nuclear power plants around the country, now chief engineer at Fair Winds Associates. Arnie Gunderson, welcome to Democracy Now! Talk about what you're concerned about.
Yeah, thanks for having me. The key here is that when a uranium atom splits, that only gives off about 95% of the power. So when these plants shut down, 5% of the power is still going to come out of the power plants after they're shut down. I think the industry should preemptively shut down plants in the storm's wake, but it's not going to solve the entire problem. It's really likely that the grid, the electric grid that's out there, will collapse, and these plants will become islands. Electric islands, and they'll have to rely on their diesel generators to provide power. A bunch of these plants are in refuelings right now, and when you're in a refueling outage, you are not required to have all your diesels running. You can be tearing apart one and only have one diesel on available. So the concern is that should they lose off-site power, all of this heat needs to be removed, and you're relying on just one diesel to keep the nuclear reactor cool.
Can you talk about what you feel needs to happen right now, and talk about nuclear power plants in Connecticut and Vermont, your main concern?
Yeah, the biggest problem, as I see it right now, is the Oyster Creek plant, which is on Barnegat Bay in New Jersey. That appears to be right about the center of the storm. Oyster Creek is the same design, but even older than Fukushima Daiichi Unit 1. It's in a refueling outage. That means that all the nuclear fuel is not in the nuclear reactor, but it's over in the spent fuel pool. And in that condition, there's no backup power for the spent fuel pools. So if Oyster Creek were to lose its off-site power, and then frankly that's really likely, there will be no way to cool that nuclear fuel that's in the fuel pool until they get the power reestablished. Nuclear fuel pools don't have to be cooled by diesels per the old Nuclear Regulatory Commission regulations. I hope the Nuclear Regulatory Commission changes that and forces the industry to cool its nuclear fuel pools as well. This time of year, there's a lot of power plants in refueling outages, and all of those plants will be in a situation where there's no fuel in the nuclear reactor. It's all in the fuel pool. Systems have been shut down to be maintained, including diesels, perhaps even completely dismantled. And in the event that there's a loss of off-site power from the high winds from this hurricane, we will see the water in the fuel pools begin to heat up.
Neil Sheehan, a representative of the U.S. Nuclear Regulatory Commission, said these plants have to be able to withstand all sorts of natural phenomena, earthquakes, severe flooding, tropical storms, lightning storms, tornadoes. They need to be able to deal with all that. We like to say they're very robust structures. They can deal with a lot of punishment, but at the same time, they have procedures in place to guide them through this. So then, Arnie Gundersen, what is your concern?
You know, this isn't like the big bad wolf. They can huff and puff, and they won't blow this plant down, especially a hurricane that's only 85-mile-an-hour winds. It's not a question of the winds from this hurricane blowing the plant down. It's a question of the loss of off-site power. That's exactly what happened after Fukushima Daiichi. The earthquake destroyed the off-site power. At that point, the nuclear plant relies on its diesels. And my big concern is diesel reliability and the fact that nuclear plants don't have to cool their nuclear fuel pools off their diesels per NRC regulations. I think those are the two big concerns for Hurricane Sandy.
Tell us what's happening in Vermont. Tell us what's happening with Vermont Yankee, Arnie Gundersen, a plant you know well.
Yeah, Irene hit Vermont Yankee pretty hard, and we were expecting a little less rain from Sandy than we were from Irene. It was interesting, talk about the law of unanticipated consequences. There was so much flooding in Vermont that large gas canisters that people had in their backyard to heat their homes or heat their trailer parks or to heat their barbecues went floating down the Connecticut River and bumped into a hydroelectric dam, which is just south of Vermont Yankee. And the state police actually blocked off the road heading into Vermont Yankee because they were afraid all the hydrogen in those canisters was likely to explode. Now, that's not in the design bases of a nuclear power plant. Nobody ever thought that, that we'd have to worry about explosive gases floating down rivers by our nuclear plants and potentially causing damage. Here in Vermont, I think we'll have a less severe event near our nuclear plant than we had last year, but it really depends on the degree of the flooding.
What are the most important issues we can learn from Fukushima right now in the United States, and how does climate change fit in with both? Arnie Gundersen.
Well, climate change has affected nuclear plants this year. Quite a few had to reduce power in the summer because river flow rates had dropped and there wasn't enough water to cool them. And that happened in France and around the world as well. So we portray nuclear power as a way to eliminate climate change, but in fact, we need to solve climate change before we can have nuclear power plants because there's just not enough cooling water to cool these plants in the event of hot summers. Well, now in the fall, and the lesson from Daiichi is that the nuclear fuel pools are a major liability. There's more nuclear, more cesium in the fuel pool at Vermont Yankee than was ever exploded in all of the 700 above-ground bomb testing. I think the most important lesson we can take out of the Fukushima Daiichi in climate change, and especially with Hurricane Sandy, is that we can't expect to cool these fueling pools. We need to remove the fuel. We need to put it in dry casks and get it down from these high fuel pools, get it down onto the ground in dry cask storage. The Nuclear Regulatory Commission is not insisting on that because it's going to cost a couple $2 billion for the industry.
Arnie Gundersen, I want to turn south for a moment to Patrick